All right, great. Well, we're recording. We have 3 judges present and accounted for, which means we can officially kick off. Welcome to Unit 1. We have our Nevada State champions from Reno High School. My name's Emily Voss. I am the We the People coordinator for Virginia, and I'll be your timekeeper today. In just a moment, I will hand things over to your judges. They will introduce themselves. They'll ask you to do the same. And then we can proceed as you have no doubt been rehearsing in your sleep. They'll read you the question and you'll respond with your 4-minute statement. And then we have follow-up questions with 2 extra bonus minutes today. So judges, I've been alerted that there will be a bell at some point here in the next 5 minutes. So we'll just let that be known just in case. All right, so judges, please go ahead and take things from here.
Well, thank you, Emily. There might be a dog barking in my world. I've had an unruly pup this morning. So I'm Tim Moore. I'm from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution at the University of Wisconsin. And my colleagues are?
I'm Sue Leeson, Senior Justice, Oregon Supreme Court.
I'm Miriam Amar-Sadeghi. I participated in We the People the first year it was offered on the bicentennial of the Constitution, long time ago. Very happy to be with you.
And you are?
Hello, we are Reno High's Unit 1. My name is Giovanni Galliotto, and I'll be attending the Air Force Academy.
My name is Oliver Guinan. I'll be attending Yale University.
My name is Sophia Nebeski. I'll be attending the University of San Francisco.
And my name is Varun Giri-Theran. I'll be attending the University of British Columbia. Our unit coach is Mr. Brian Carlin, and our teacher is Mr. Richard Clark.
And as Ms. Voss pointed out, we're going to have 2 bells going off, one in about 3 minutes and one in about 8 minutes.
So then you're going to go vote? Is that calling you to the floor to vote? Just kidding.
Yes. Yeah.
I will read the question. We're going to spend some time with Benjamin Rush here a little bit. Quote, the American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. To what extent, if any, did revolutionary principles influence constitution making during the founding period? What problems, if any, does the principle of consent present when creating or amending constitutions? To what extent, if any, are revolutionary principles in modern times? You may begin.
Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet, and yet must be, the land where every man is free. For poet Langston Hughes, America was a dream the dreamers dreamed. But there was never equality for me, Hughes wrote, nor freedom in this homeland of the free.
Nevertheless, Hughes and the founding generation swore the same oath, that despite broken promises, America will be. 2 revolutionary principles animated their constitution making: popular sovereignty and political equality.
First, popular sovereignty is revolutionary because it opposes monarchy. James Madison extols popular sovereignty in Federalist 49, writing that the polity is the only legitimate fountain of power in a republic. And in his thoughts on government, John Adams writes that a Republican legislator should be in miniature, an exact portrait of the people at large.
Madison's and Adams' thinking informed early state constitutions. For example, Section 2 of the 1776 Virginia Constitution contends that all powers vested in and derived from the people. Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution codifies popular sovereignty by guaranteeing every state a republican form of government.
Second principle is political equality. Political equality is revolutionary because it opposes nobility. The Continental Congress's Declaration of Independence asserts that all men are created equal, and early state constitutions reflect a transition toward this principle. The 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution holds that all men are born equally free and independent. Further, in the US Constitution, there are no property requirements for office holding, and Article 6 prohibits religious tests. Hughes recognized that political equality was central to American constitution making. Equality is in the air we breathe, he wrote.
The American Revolution teaches us that government derives its power from our consent, and that it should consider everyone's consent equally. However, in 1789, political equality was far from the political reality. In the Fugitive Slave and 3/5 clauses, the Constitution sanctioned a violent slave society, and women would not receive the right to vote for 146 years. Herein lie three problems the principle of consent creates when drafting or amending constitutions.
Problem 1. Under what conditions can we legitimately consent? Surely not when shackles bind our hands and feet, or when we are forced to forfeit our property upon marriage.
Problem 2. How do we consent to a document written 250 years ago? According to John Locke, through obeying society's laws, we express tacit consent. However, tacit consent begins and ends with our happiness. We cannot consent to a society we cannot enjoy.
So problem 3, what do we do when we do not consent? In 1775, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress declared that citizens who refuse to assert their natural rights commit high treason against God. For the Congress, citizens had a right to revolution to protect their life, liberty, or property.
However, like all rights, our right to revolution is not absolute. Indeed, Jefferson observes that prudence ensures that government will not be changed for light and transient causes. Only after a pattern of malicious abuse do we have a right to form a new one.
Today, revolutionary principles guide us towards the promise of something better. The revolutionary principle of popular sovereignty inspired the 17th Amendment, which gave voters the power to elect their senators. Today, popular sovereignty animates attempts to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment and pass election reform.
But there are many challenges. Mass incarceration and police brutality undermine political equality and popular sovereignty. For Trayvon Martin, George Floyd, and so many others, opportunity was not real, nor life free, even though they lived in the land of liberty. To realize political equality, citizens must not only be subject to the law, but also protected by it.
Langston Hughes demonstrates that revolutionary principles guide us. Because we the people, Hughes says, through sweat and blood, faith and pain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Thank you.
All right, let's start with the Anti-Federalists. They accused the Federalists of betraying the principles of the American Revolution. What were the details of this argument?
Absolutely, the Anti-Federalists were really concerned with sovereignty in the states. They really thought that the states should hold all the power and that citizens within states needed to hold that power. And they thought the Federalists, through providing too much power to the federal government, were usurping that state sovereign power that they had fought so hard for in the Revolution.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Oliver.
Oh, sure. A key aspect of this debate ultimately boils down to the Connecticut Compromise, which is ultimately why states have equal representation in the Senate today.
Well, weren't people better represented and more? Weren't the people sovereign within their states? I mean, to your idea of popular sovereignty?
Yes, they may have been more represented, but one big issue is they lacked a lot of the protections and immunities, which is shown by Article 4 of the Constitution, which allows for protections in states and that federalism aspect of the national government coming in to help. So although they did have more sovereignty, they lacked protections and certain immunities.
Additionally, the framers crafted an electoral model that they thought would reduce sectionalism, which was a fear that Madison had in Federalist 10.
And of course, Benjamin Rush writes in his speech that while the Articles of Confederation might have been effective for achieving the immediate goals of the American Revolution, it was not effective for engendering any kind of conditions for democracy, because it didn't create any union among states nor union among citizens.
Thank you.
I wonder if you can give me an example of how Article 4 has worked to guarantee the states a Republican form of government.
Article 4 is especially pertinent when the United States is incorporating new territories. So for example, Article 4 played a key role in introducing Republican governments to states that were becoming new states after the Louisiana Purchase.
But when there have been court challenges alleging the lack of a Republican guarantee or Republican form of government, say during the reapportionment revolution, the courts have backed away saying, hey, Article 4, that's just a political doctrine. We're not going there. So it has no teeth.
Idealistically, only idealistically really has Article 4 been used through establishing the right to, in constitutions like the Nevada Constitution in Article 11 to establish schools. creating educated citizenry helps guarantee a Republican form of government. But in practice, Article 4 hasn't been used to really establish a Republican form of government through the courts.
But I disagree that Article 4 has no teeth. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause and its enforcement provision, as well as Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, certainly should Congress choose to give Article 4 teeth, they can use it based on those provisions.
They don't need to under the Equal Protection Clause. That's a separate provision that would go in the same direction. But in any event, when you look at the reapportionment revolution, which led to one person, one vote in the states, brought as an Article 4 case, dumped. People had to come back, find an alternative constitutional theory in order to get the courts to give it any attention at all. And I'm just curious why you think that is. It's a lovely guarantee, but it just doesn't seem to stand for anything substantive. Especially if we can get there through other routes.
Like a lot of our rights, like political equality, it's very idealistic. Although we've been searching for political equality, it's a much more idealistic value than it really is a principle that's directly used in practice. Article 4 republicanism is something that's really idealistic. It hasn't been used concretely because there's other ways that people can try to redress their grievances.
And going back to going back to the revolutionary document, the Declaration of Independence, those ideologies, although they're not a specific form of governance, and as Thomas Jefferson put it, the pursuit of happiness and life and liberty, those three principles don't always have to have specific law, but the ideological understanding behind it is what's the most important thing.
And of course, just like
let's move on. Somebody else may have a question.
Today's America and your place in it. I mean, I appreciated Langston Hughes because it's sort of America as an aspiration, always trying, always aiming for the ideal. What do you think are the biggest threats to consent currently? And do you see technology, social media, more as a threat or an opportunity to expand consent?
For me, please continue.
I would argue that technology emphasizes our chances to consent. One of the most effective ways we're able to consent is through voting. And luckily we have President Joe Biden implementing executive orders that not only emphasizes voter registration and election information, but also updates convenient websites such as vote.gov so that people are able to access this information more easily.
In addition, there's still issues with voting. If we look at Branovic v. DNC, which is a surprisingly recent case, there are still many cases where the VRA lacks certain clauses which can actually help encourage voting for those who lack that right and are discouraged from it.
To your first question, for me, the biggest issue facing political equality and consent today is mass incarceration. In most states, felons do not receive a right to vote. Now, this is antithetical to these revolutionary principles that we're talking about, because if we believe that voting is foundational to democracy, then depriving that right and thereby pushing somebody out of the social contract for just violating one law is antithetical to that idea.
In your presentation, you talked about one of the three concerns being what we do when we don't consent, but I didn't hear that question filled in. How do you address that?
When we don't
How do I
consent,
know when I don't consent, and how do I reflect it?
well, like
The biggest way we can
Oh, go Gio.
The biggest way we can consent directly, as Benjamin Rush writes, is through voting. Voting on election days is how we express our direct consent. And so when groups of people aren't given the right to vote, like the new Georgia bill SB 202 that's restricting minority voting, taking away that direct consent that gives the most consent possible is a big way that consent is undermined, and a big way of knowing if your consent is valid.
Cicero
Okay,
writes,
but when I vote, it's to make public policy, right? How do I express my disagreement with something fundamental in the social compact? In other words, probably constitutional.
Well, I mean, really the only way to express your discontent, it's the only way to do so would be through legislation. It's not necessarily possible, like the Virginia Declaration of Rights includes in Article 1, it's not possible to remove oneself from the social contract. And so dissent by that means is illegitimate.
How about social movements and civil disobedience? Have we had fundamental shifts in what this country is all about through that?
Yeah, absolutely. But the key point here is that for most of those social movements, they're advocating against what Martin Luther King Jr. calls morally unjust law, or what Cicero would call something that doesn't align with higher law. They're advocating against specific policies that don't represent them. It's important to make the distinction that they're not advocating against government writ large. They're not rescinding their consent to be governed generally.
So no reform movement could ever be revolutionary?
No, that's not entirely the case, because as long as there is an actual change in some sort, it could be in legislation or whatever change it inspires. So take the civil rights movement, for example, that helped for less segregation, and it helped solve those issues. So having those miniature revolutions helps progress the United States as a country.
So
George
I'm just going to make
Washington in his farewell address addresses the exact issue, stating that the American Revolution is the only accurate use of revolution. And only through this revolution have we been able to create the amendment process and all these other things that enable us to redress our grievances without completely destroying our government.
Okay.
Thank you. I guess I'll start out. I appreciated the fact in your opening statement, I thought the use of Langston Hughes as aspirational was good. I also appreciated the fact that you mentioned and elaborated with some detail two early state constitutions, Virginia and Pennsylvania, and I thought that was quite effective. Your use of consent problems is in your 4 minutes was quite effective. I guess I would have liked a little bit more on this early fight about who the true inheritors of the revolution were. In other words, how the Anti-Federalists accused these creepy Federalists of doing all kinds of un-American agendas. So I would have liked a little bit more beefy on that. I thought, this whole guarantee clause is so interesting, and I know we pushed you on that quite a bit, but it's an interesting point that it's there, and in principle, it might be, the principle, it might be aspirational. So that's a hard one, and I thought we pushed you around a little bit on that, and you're to be congratulated for wrestling with that. And I'll leave Sue to elaborate on that if she wants to. What I would urge you to maybe think about is consent. There's an argument to be made for consent is only when you're making systems. That everything after that is just policy preferences, and so voting isn't consent. Political parties, whether they reflect their constituencies or not, that's way after the consent moment. I mean, Wilson himself said, James Wilson, the American people exercise their consent once, and then it's over when the Constitution was created. So I'd urge you to think about policy versus consent, structural consent to a system. But other than that, I've enjoyed this, and I feel like we've had a conversation, and that's important. And I've really enjoyed the last 10 minutes that we've had together.
Well, and I'll take the next stand because I want to follow up on a couple of things Tim said. If we only consent once, one of my questions, did Rhode Island consent? It felt badgered into ratifying because it knew that military power would take it out if it didn't join the Union. Can you consent at with the threat of the barrel of a gun. Those are some of the kind of deeper issues I wish we could have gotten into. If my state decides to eliminate the state legislature and pass all laws through the initiative process, can I look to the federal government to say, wait a minute, I've just been deprived of my Republican form of government? Those kinds of movements are going on, and I think we've really got to weigh into some of those issues. You argued that the expansion of popular sovereignty is reflected in the 17th Amendment, direct election of the senators. Didn't change the structure of the Senate. I live in a small state. I'm benefiting from the fact that I get 2 senators. But gosh, if I'm a Californian or a New Yorker or a Texan, I don't feel like my popular sovereignty has been expanded all that much just because I get to vote directly for them. I still am being disadvantaged by my lack of representation proportionate to population in that body. So those are the kinds of things I'd love to have heard you address. I love that you jumped into the state constitutions and didn't just argue that the revolutionary stuff was done at the Constitutional Convention. There was a whole lot to like in what you did, a very, very engaging conversation. Just more to think about, so thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I also really enjoyed listening to you. I felt like you guys were sharp. You know, you were dribbling the ball constantly, and you had thought about a lot of these issues, not just from the vantage point of consuming information and facts, but also what you think about things. Oliver, I thought that your point about these social movements, civil disobedience, the civil rights movement in particular, it's not about changing the fundamentals. It's actually using the fundamentals to create a more perfect union, to have those rights. And, you know, quite frankly, we're very, very lucky as a nation because we have those founding principles are sound. And so in order to, it is a matter of just making that consent genuine for every generation rather than to have to fundamentally alter. Yeah. So I wish you the best. You guys are going to some great schools, and Air Force and Haverford and UCSF and Varun, where are you going again?
I'm going to the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah.